Meditation practice. Mindfulness meditation involves sitting still, quieting the mind through conscious breathing, and practicing what's called bare awareness. Bare awareness is the context of mindfulness meditation, is the simple act of being aware, of noticing the thoughts in your mind or the sensations in your body in the present moment. For example, when you're sitting quietly, you might be aware of your fingers as sore. This is bare awareness. Mindfulness is awareness of the totality of the present moment. For example, if your fingers are sore, at first you may focus only on this one piece of the experience, the sensation in the finger. But if you practice mindfulness, you may become aware of more of what's going on in that moment as well. Perhaps your heart is working well. Perhaps your neck is not tense, and there is the sound of wind coming from somewhere. Perhaps that sound makes you think about your home, which provokes a pang of emotion. We tend to dwell myopically on the problem in front of us. We think that's all there is. When you focus on the totality of the present moment, you become aware that there are positive elements in that moment as well as painful ones. Listening to the wind, you are aware that the wind is as present, as real as the sensation in the finger, and you can bring your concentration there. Of course, our minds have a very strong tendency to wander. So you may start with the sensation in the finger, notice the wind, think of home, and then wonder if you left the toaster oven on, or think about the broken window at home that you need to fix. Mindfulness requires a returning to the present we are in, and the breath is the most effective tool for doing this. Mindfulness is a practice, not a destination. Again and again, we bring the mind back to awareness of the breath and stay with the breath, the sensation of the finger, or the sound of the wind. You can practice becoming aware of thoughts and sensations in a non-associative way, with non-attachment, and consistently bringing your mind and attention back to the present moment. It's as if you step away from yourself and observe yourself in the moment and say, okay, self, I'm experiencing anxiety right now. I can observe this anxiety welling up. You stay with the experience of the emotion in the present moment by being aware of it, rather than reacting to it or getting swept away by it. This simple act is the first step in familiarizing yourself with the practice of returning to and learning to dwell in that space between stimulus and response. When you practice mindfulness, you become aware that there's a difference between being aware that you are angry or anxious and being mindful of your anger or your anxiety. To be mindful of your anger or anxiety, you must be aware of yourself on purpose and observe your reactions to things in a non-attached way, almost as if you were observing yourself from outside of yourself. You just notice your own mind and what's passing through it without identifying personally with those thoughts and feelings. In Stillness Speaks, Eckhart Tolle writes, quote, boredom, anger, sadness, or fear are not yours, not personal. They are conditions of the mind. They come and go. Nothing that comes and goes is you. Hip-hop entrepreneur and yoga enthusiast Russell Simmons had his own take on that experience. In his book, Do You, Simmons describes the observation of the mind and the self that comes with mindfulness meditation. Quote, once you have an appreciation of breathing stillness and silence, the fruits of meditation will be within your grasp, he writes. When you spend those 15 moments breathing slowly in silence, you'll start to see all your issues and dramas for what they are, distractions. You might think about your job or your relationships, but you won't get tangled up over analyzing them. Instead, you'll understand how to let it all go. When your mind is quiet, you can be what the yogis call the watcher. You're in a state when you can just watch what's happening in your head instead of being controlled by it. According to Buddhist tradition, this watcher is the consciousness that lives in that center space. It's our capacity to live fully in the present moment, and that allows us to keep calm and carry on. The minute you connect to your watcher or your center space, where you're able to make space between stimulus and response, whatever anxiety or distractions you might feel will dissipate. You'll have better control of your responses to things around you, be it on a full marathon championship or an emotionally charged encounter with someone who pushes all your buttons. Andrew Bynum, the NBA All-Star who I worked with for many years, calls this getting my zen on. Like many other elite athletes, he knows that taking even a few minutes every day to practice meditation in this way will make it easier to slow down time and respond better to whatever actions or challenges are happening around you. As Bruce Lee wrote, be like water. The iconic martial artist Bruce Lee famously declared, be like water. Those 3 words pretty much sum up the mindset of the mindful athlete and the spiritual warrior who lives life in conscious flow all the time. Water, for starters, responds rather than reacts. It literally flows. It's powerful, yet it yields to the lay of the land rather than exerting unnecessary force. In fact, it actually gets force through yielding. Many people use water and the ocean as a metaphor for our emotional states of mind. Even when the waves crashing on the surface of the ocean, there's always a vast, calm space deep below. When we meditate, we access that inner space within ourselves. Along these lines, Sharon Salzberg wrote in her book Loving Kindness that practicing meditation produces a tremendous change in perspective. At first, it is as if we were sitting on the shore and watching the waves dance on the surface of the ocean. Later, in meditation, it is as if we are under the water, in the calm, still depths, watching the waves above us moving and playing. Still later, we perceive that, in fact, we are the water, not apart or separate, and that wave is happening. In keeping with the metaphor of the ocean, remember this: waves only wreak havoc on the surface, or on a very small part of the ocean. Most of the ocean is unimaginably spacious, calm, and deep. In the vastness of this space, things that seem gigantic and dangerous on the surface dissipate and even seem inconsequential. There is distance and objectivity, even intelligence, because intelligence is present when you see things from a larger perspective. Mindfulness helps us to be like water in this way, and to truly understand that whatever waves are rocking our personal boats, or whatever stresses or challenges are flying away in the practice of our sport, we have a choice to reconnect to that deep place within us at all times, and to act from that space between stimulus and response. In so doing, we aren't tossed around by those waves. We see them for what they are. There's great power and wisdom in this. The Olympic swimmer Michael Phelps is a great example of this. He broke his wrist trying to enter a car while training for the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. His coach reminded him that if you can't work with your upper body, you can work harder on the lower. So he had to refocus his training to his legs while his wrist healed. Phelps was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as a child and began swimming at the age of 7, partly because his sisters had just joined a swim team and partly to provide him with an outlet for his restless energy. With his wrist broken, he had to choose whether to disperse or rechannel his energy. He rechanneled his energy and went on to win 8 gold medals. Salzberg talks about the accepting and transformative capacity of water even further when she talks about what's happening to a teaspoon of salt when it's put into water. When it's poured into a very small glass of water, that teaspoon of salt has a huge impact. But put that same teaspoon in a large body of water, like in a lake or an ocean, and the intensity of the impact is dispersed and diminishes because of the vastness and openness of the vessel receiving it, writes Salzberg. Even when the salt remains the same, the spaciousness of the vessel receiving it changes everything. This is another way of suggesting that the more deeply connected we are to the vastness of our own still, quiet center, the less thrown off balance we are by whatever distractions and challenges come our way, big and small. That said, some distractions and challenges are pretty damn big. Doing a Thich Nhat Hanh, the intercom bell of mindfulness. When I was teaching mindfulness in prisons, I understood what is meant when people refer to a hell realm. If hell exists, it's here. You could feel the oppression and emotional torment in that place just standing at the gatehouse. Some of the inmates had been locked up 24/7 for many years. The prison management gave me access to a little office where I could teach groups of inmates how to practice mindfulness meditation, but inevitably during meditation, the corrections officer's voice would suddenly come blaring over the intercom, breaking the silence with his authoritative tone. And the second that happened, the inmates instantly reacted and slipped out of the present moment. Whatever that particular corrections officer represented to them, authority, injustice, anger, hatred, the emotional drama and the violence of whatever crimes had landed them in there in the first place, all instantly came flooding back. Instead of cultivating peace and serenity in their minds, they were suddenly cultivating hatred or anger without even realizing it. I was sitting there with a group of inmates who'd gone from peaceful to pissed off in a span of a second. The program I was teaching in this particular prison used to be voluntary, and then it became mandatory. One inmate started every group complaining about having to do something he wasn't interested in doing. I told him he could leave if he didn't want to be in the class, and he responded that he could get into trouble if he did so. I reminded him that he could choose to do so anyway and take the punishment. In this case, the punishment would have been what they call a D, or disciplinary report. Or I told him he could choose to stay for himself, not because the CO told him it was mandatory. This particular inmate ended up being one of those who always came to class early, successfully completed it, and was probably sorry when it was over. Sometimes life, whether on the inside or outside of prison, is like that CO's voice over the loudspeaker. Stuff comes flying out of nowhere to throw us off our game. So I decided to turn this moment of adversity into a moment of opportunity by doing what I call a Thich Nhat Hanh. I had the inmates presented with the intercom that the bell was one of mindfulness, a reminder to come back to their breathing and the quiet place within. The very fact that it was the CO's voice gave them an even greater opportunity to practice coming back to the present moment. And eventually, this is what happened. Every time that intercom went off with the CO's voice resonating throughout the room, the inmates practiced paying attention to the emotions and sensations that arose. They practiced observing them for what they were. Oh, check that out. I hear the CO's voice. I am feeling intense anger at this moment, without all the emotional reactivity, or at least trying to step outside of it. They tried to just experience things as they were, without the interference of belief systems. This lengthened the process of perception, which helped their minds focus on the moment rather than go to the place of emotional overwhelm. Over time, it became possible for the inmates to just be fully present with their breathing as the object of their meditation. It was a peaceful and powerful experience for them to be able to sit with the intercom coming on without succumbing to a knee-jerk emotional reaction, and it was surely a practice that would serve them when they got back into civilian life. Of course, there are countless intercoms in life that trigger and set us all off, like fear, anxiety, depression, anger. It's easy to blow an emotional gasket or to reach for something to ease the pain. I know, because I've been there and done that big time. Mindfulness meditation helps us understand the operation of our minds and emotions. It teaches us how to observe ourselves and our habitual patterns in a non-attached fashion and to let go in order to truly be like water. Which brings me back to Bruce Lee, one of my superheroes. On with the target. I was definitely not alone in my reverence for Bruce Lee back when he burst on the scene in the late 1970s. I was in college at the time, in that liminal space before I let go of sports and drifted farther away from the hinterland of substance abuse. But I watched that guy Lee on the big screen, and like millions of people, was in awe of his badass Buddhist prowess and spiritual warrior nature. So indulge me here while I take a brief historical flashback to Lee, who had a big impact on our culture and was perhaps America's first widely recognized mindful athlete par excellence. Lee, for those of you too young to remember, was an expert in Jeet Kune Do, a martial art that's predicated on the idea of moving fluidly, like water, and staying perpetually in a zone state, even in the midst of battle, which is where Lee often found himself, kicking and karate chopping his way through evil in various movie roles, from The Chinese Connection to Enter the Dragon. Lee was all about the mind-body connection, and the idea that the mind is as powerful as a weapon, if not more so than the body. He was intensely cool, and he inspired countless Americans to flock to their local dojos for the first time to try to marry mind, body, and soul, and kick some ass at the same time. Lee is well known for his mix of hardcore athleticism and Buddhist-infused philosophical reflections that pertained as much to sports as they did to life in general. Americans were most familiar with Lee on the big screen, but it was the TV hit series Kung Fu in the early 70s that brought much of his thinking to popular mainstream culture. Debuting in 1972, Kung Fu was a mystic western that featured David Carradine in the role of Kwai Chang Caine, a monk trained in the Shaolin Temple in China, who wandered around the American West, repelling bad guys with his spiritual warrior prowess. Despite some controversy in Hollywood, Bruce Lee is widely credited with being the influence for this hugely popular TV series. In one Kung Fu scene that dramatized what it means to be a spiritual warrior and an almost transcendentally accomplished mindful athlete, Caine is at a campsite at night with a young cowboy. He's been talking about the connections between archery and meditation, which of course the cowboy doesn't quite understand. The scene unfolds like this. Cowboy: meditation? What do you think about? Caine: I think of nothing but to be one with the target. Caine draws his bow, turns his head away from the target, and shoots his arrow. It hits the bullseye. Cowboy: you think I'm going to believe that? Caine: watch my eyes. Caine draws the bow again and turns his head away from the target again. This time he shuts his eyes and shoots. He hits the bullseye. Cowboy: how'd you do that? Caine: I do not do it. It is not done. Cowboy: what do you mean it is not done? Caine: it is only experienced. It happens. Cowboy: it happens? Caine: the pole, the arrow, the bow are all one. Not many things, not different things. One. Well, I see it, but I sure don't understand it. Good. Why is it good? It remains a puzzle. When you cease to strive to understand, then you will know without understanding. Most of us didn't understand what the heck Caine was talking about, yet we knew he was onto something big. Caine became a role model for countless aspiring mindful athletes who wanted to cultivate the ability to effortlessly be at one with their sport, like Caine was with his bow and arrow. Even a traditional jock football player could catch a glimpse of greatness here. Caine's wise words were Lee's wise words, and they became a sort of credo for the mindful athlete. What you habitually think largely determines what you will ultimately become, Lee said in his book Letters of the Dragon, introducing the idea that our minds drive not only our performance, but also our sense of self and the reality we create for ourselves. He was basically playing the inner game of martial arts before anyone had heard of the term. Lee was inspired in part by a small but groundbreaking book published in 1948 called Zen and the Art of Archery. It was written by a German philosopher named Hegel and translated into English in 1955. Hegel had studied Buddhism and martial arts in Asia before most Americans knew what a karate chop was. His book launched an enduring industry of the Zen of books, including at the time the very influential Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. In Zen and the Art of Archery, Hegel summed up the mindful body-sports connection as it relates to archery in this way. The archer ceases to become conscious of himself as one who is engaged in hitting the bullseye which confronts him. This state of unconsciousness is realized only when, completely empty and rid of the self, he becomes one with the performing of his technical skill, though there is in it something of a quite different order which cannot be attained by any progressive study of the art. Some American athletes were taking note of this Buddhist concept in Hegel's book, that it's an empty mind and transversing your sense of self is where you're actually able to perform at levels way above the norm, while, of course, at the same time you're continuing to perfect your technical skill. One of these people was Tim Galway. 2 years after Kung Fu debuted on TV, Galway published The Inner Game of Tennis, a hugely successful book that explored the mind-body connection in a traditional sport and officially put the term inner game in our vocabulary, while also launching an entire industry of the inner game of nearly every popular pursuit. In The Inner Game of Tennis, Galway describes two selves. Self one is the analytical, ego-driven, anxious self that drives many of our actions and preoccupies our mind. This is the self that flits continually out of the present moment, latching onto various inner obstacles and tripping up our game. Self two is the intuitive, unconscious mind that transcends those obstacles and allows us to feel at one with everything around us. Self two lives entirely in the present moment and holds the key to conscious flow in life. The key to the inner game involves putting self two in the driver's seat and putting self one in the back seat. In so doing, as we play the game of tennis or any sport, our actions are motivated from that deep, still, and all-knowing center. So we are back at noticing that center space between stimulus and response, where mindfulness helps us transcend the mental chatter and patterns of self-doubt and relinquish control to self two. This is not easy when you live most of your life paying attention to and taking your cues from self one. As is the case with any sport or art, the only way to do it is through regular practice. With enough practice, even if you commit just a few minutes a day, it eventually becomes easier for you to toggle between self one and self two. This is an invaluable technique when you're in the midst of competition, feeling the heat of pressure bearing down on you, and you want to calm down and access flow even while you amp up your performance. This practice of the inner game can be applied in all areas of life, as Galway himself noted. There is no separating who we are when we play sports from who we are in the world at large. When you are flowing and clear in your physical practice, there is a synergetic clarity that flows into other areas of your life as well. When Galway describes the principles of the inner game, he is essentially describing mindfulness, practicing non-judgmental awareness, unlearning bad habits, and learning the art of relaxed concentration. Galway writes, "The play of the inner game comes to value the art of relaxed concentration above all other skills. He discovers a true basis for self-confidence, and she learns that the secret to winning any game lies in not trying too hard. They aim at the kind of spontaneous performance which occurs only when the mind is calm and seems at one with the body, which finds its own surprising ways to surpass its own limits again and again. This intuitive process, says Galway, doesn't have to be learned, as we already know it, and that what is needed is to unlearn those habits which interfere with this, and then to just let it happen." I became something of an expert in unlearning and letting it happen. This could only really happen once I'd committed myself to a regular mindfulness practice. I then learned how to concentrate on breathing life into the present moment, literally and figuratively.